Today I'm going to be taking a look at my first Stowa watch. It is a really cool German brand that I think doesn't get too much love in the collector community, or at the very least it's kind of a little bit undervalued. But let's get into this video and hope you enjoy. We have a diameter of 37 millimeters, a lug to lug of 47, a height of 9.5, and we have a lug width of 18 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch: we're going to have the ETA 2804 hand wound movement in here, beats at 28,800 vibrations per hour, 42-hour power reserve, and we're going to have 15 meters of water resistance. This is a hacking movement, this is a hand winding movement, and sapphire on the front and back crystal, and all the lume applied on the dial is C3 Superluminova. So looking at the dial of this watch, we can see it is very, very classically designed, very elegant. It has those classic kind of syringe style hands. It doesn't even have a counterbalance to it, which I thought would have thrown me off a little bit more than it has. I do think it would have looked cool with the counterbalance, but it does kind of leave it kind of clean without one. We have these classic Arabic style numerals printed along the outside, and then the minutes track printed alongside that. Looking at the color of the dial, we have more of a grayish charcoal leaning black than we do with actual deep black. If I bring in this Visitor Linden here, which has that nice deep inky black, you can just tell the difference between the tones there. Overall, very cleanly done dial. I like that they kept the text really minimal, just the branding of Stowa, the kind of classical old style logo there with the S slanted, hand winding in German beneath that, and Partitio, or however you say this model name, printed at the 6 o'clock there. Very minimal text. They didn't put anything on it they don't need. Overall, I think it's a really nicely designed dial, very clean. I don't love the lume signature of the C3 because it does lean kind of greenish, while if I again bring the Visitor in, that's very much white compared to this kind of greenish beige-ish leaning tone, but hey, it still is a nice looking watch. And just the kind of the last thing I would like to note about the dial is how well done like the hands are, just in general of their, I guess, length. The minutes hand track goes all the way out to the very end of that minutes track. The hour hand just touches basically the hour markers. So, and again, the seconds hand goes all the way out to the very end. So they're actually proportioned well for this watch, and it's kind of that attention to detail that you usually don't see unless you step up higher in price. Zooming in on the dial a little more, we can see there is that kind of subtle grainy texture to it, which I find is kind of the case when there's dials that kind of lean a little lighter than the actual base color would suggest. Has that kind of grainy texture to it. As you can see, all the numeral applique is done really, really well. It's outlined very nicely. The lume has a nice three-dimensional look to it. Definitely nicely applied. I don't see really any imperfections in that. It's interesting kind of how fuzzy the outline is. It's not bad by any means, just an interesting kind of take I haven't seen very often. Looking at the hands, we can see there's some dirtiness near the base hand stack. There's even a little bit of like scratches near the base of that hour hand there. But overall, the lume is applied really nicely to the hands. Again, there are little tiny blemishes throughout them, but none of them come to life on the wrist or really just from the naked eye. So, I mean, overall, this dial is printed well. It is finished well. It is kind of just what you would expect for the price point, nothing above, nothing below. So moving on to the case of this watch, and it's done simply, but it's executed well. It is a very, very simple case, all polished, no brushed finishes here. We have a very, very, I mean, really just circular case profile. It is the equivalent of just a perfect circle with like lugs welded on in a way. More traditional case shapes are a little bit more, I guess, you know, oysterish, where there's an integration in a way. There's a little bit more of a bell shape. There's a little bit more conjoinment between the lugs and the case rather than looking kind of added on after the fact. But again, the case is done really well. We have a nice well-sized crown, and it's good because this is a hand wound movement. Very easy to grip, very easy to wind. Nice Stowa logo there. Just taking a look at the side profile for a second. Again, this is only about 9.5 millimeters thin, so it's going to wear really well on the wrist. There is even a little bit of curve down to those lugs there, so you're going to really have no problem wearing this on the wrist. Something I do like is they did go fairly long on the lugs relatively to the case body, but they didn't overdo it like someone like Nomos would. I believe their 36 millimeter had about a 47 lug to lug, and this is a 37 with a 47 lug to lug. So it's a little bit more proportional. I think also just the lug hole placement in conjunction with how the case is bigger, it doesn't lead to as much as a case gap as it would on a Nomos watch. And yeah, overall, very, very simple case, but it just adds on to that kind of vintage aesthetic that the watch is trying to go for. And I do like it because it's not really a style that you see too often nowadays in how I guess, simple, but simply well done the case is. Flipping over the watch, we see the movement exposed here. Pretty nicely done. We have a little bit of perlage around the under base plate. We have a little bit of striping up here. We have just all the gears kind of out in the open for maximum visibility, really. And it is a pretty nice movement to look at. It's not necessarily the prettiest movement by any means, but it does take up a good amount of the case back. It looks nice, and it's always nice to see a finished movement with a sapphire case back. One thing I would like to note about the case before we move on is just how gentle of a curve there seems to be on top. It could be a domed crystal, or it could not be, I'm not 100% sure. But there just does seem to be a nice, very gentle curve from the lug sides all the way meeting at the top point of the crystal there. And it's just one of those things that you don't really notice, but it would come together on the wrist to just create a nicer appearance overall. So moving on to how the watch wears on the wrist. Earlier I was wearing this Star King. This is an interesting watch, $50, give or take on Amazon, automatic sapphire crystal. So this is a pretty cool watch I'm gonna be reviewing soon. So here we have the watch on my 6.5 inch wrist, and I think you can just tell it wears really, really well. It doesn't look oversized by any means. It sits within the bounds of my wrist really, really well. I do think one very, very prominent part of this design is the lugs. They are relatively thin and they're relatively long. And I think the fact that they're so thin kind of makes the length of them more apparent. But they do curve down. It doesn't sit above the wrist at all. It is a thin watch. But it is something you're going to notice. It has a very prominent stance on the wrist. As you can see there, sits within the wrist really, really nicely. Just pretty much sits directly on top, not rising up above at all. Very, very comfortable to wear. Switching it up a little, we have this nice Italian leather strap from Vario. I do think this kind of like taupish, brownish color works really, really well with both the vintage feel of the watch and just the color palette on it itself. Overall, the strap wears very, very comfortably. Again, I think it fits the whole look of the watch, and I do think this is kind of a strap predisposed to wearing on leather. Moving to a slightly more casual look, we have this silicone NATO from Benchmark straps on Amazon. I believe they're around like $10, $11, $12, but I think it was really fun with the watch. There's no real apparent texture on the silicone, so it just kind of blends in nicely with the dial and the design. In the end, the silicone NATO wears really well. I think it complements the watch really nicely. It's very, very comfortable. And I just really like how it kind of plants the watch on the wrist easier than a strap would. And if you want to have a little more fun, here's this kind of like lightish blue Perlon strap, I believe from like Wrist and Style or something like that. Yeah, I mean, you can find it on Amazon most likely. Overall, I think the texture of the Perlon adds a really nice fun feeling to the watch. It is pretty comfortable to wear as long as you don't get one that's super cheap and like super scratchy, but I do like it. I think the colors play well together, and yeah. Last but not least, taking a look at the lume here. As you can see, Stowa did a pretty good job. It is well lumed, it is bright, it lasts for a pretty good amount of time, and overall I have no complaints. It would be nice maybe to see some lume on the seconds hand in some way, but overall, it is well done. And then re-luming and comparing to the Snoopy, as you can see, the color temperatures are slightly different. The Snoopy's a little bit more blue leaning, but overall, the brightness is pretty similar. Again, the Stowa did a pretty good job on what is considered, I guess, a dress watch, and yeah, the lume's not bad at all. So moving on to pros and cons, one of the biggest pros for me is, of course, going to be the 37mm case diameter. It's going to fit really good on small wrists. It's going to fit decently well on larger wrists. Maybe I'd recommend up to 7.5 inches, maybe 8, depending on how you're used to where your watch is looking or how small you want to go for a dress watch. Just depends, but it is a really, really nice size. I really do like the vintage aesthetic that this watch gives off. It really does look like a mid-century styled watch. It has kind of almost the sizing of a mid-century styled watch, which is really refreshing to see. And playing off that, it has a kind of look to it that makes it be able to fit in like dressy situations, casual situations. It's not a sports watch by any means, but it's not the most dressy dress watch possible. It doesn't have Roman numerals, it's not gold, it's not immediately super fragile. So it still has the sapphire crystal, it still has, some water resistance, but overall I think it can kind of play those two fields pretty well. And lastly, I just think the prices these use are pretty fair. I got mine for $650 for the hand-wound version, which usually retails closer to $1,000 brand new. I've seen the regular automatics go for closer to $500, $550, and those are pretty regular prices you can find them at. They don't come up for sale super often, and of course if you want to go new, you're going to have to pay that $8, $9, maybe $1,000 price, but overall it is really a good watch, and at the used prices you can get them at, it's a great watch. Moving on to cons, and my biggest con is going to be the Lume signature. The Lume is applied well, it shines brightly, but I just don't love the green leaning tint of C3 Lume. I don't know, and I don't recall off the top of my head any watches I've seen with C3 Lume that lean very, very white when it's in like natural sunlight. That's usually for BGW9, and that's just kind of the look I prefer. I prefer that stark whiteness to the dial. I prefer that nice contrast between the black and the white elements. Or if it's a colored dial, I don't want slightly green leaning Lume on my blue dialed watch. So it's things like that. I just don't love C3 in almost any application I've ever seen it in. So that's going to be a main con for me. I do think it works decently well with the dial. I mean, black and green go well together. It does lean white. I do think it gives almost a kind of vintage look to it. I honestly probably would have even preferred Fotina versus this kind of green leaning Lume, but that's just my opinion. Another con for me will be the longer lugs on this watch. It isn't a complete con, and it didn't completely, I guess, put me off from the watch, but it was something I continually noticed as I put it on the wrist. It is a longer lugged watch. It is not all the way into that Nomos territory, but it's approaching it. The lug integration is a little bit better, so like there's no strap gap, but it still is very, very prominent on wrist. You do notice the lugs, and if that's something you're kind of not wanting to, I guess, notice, then it's not going to be a watch for you. And my last slight con, it's not really necessarily a con with the watch, but it's almost, it'd be a miss not to compare this to a Nomos at the price it's appearing at for retail. At $1,000, it's getting really, really close to used Nomos prices. I've bought in a couple Nomos Club campuses at around $1,000, maybe $1,100, and then I've bought in a Nomos Club 36 at maybe $850, $950. So you can definitely get a Nomos around this price. It's a little bit of a different aesthetic. It is, I would say, not necessarily a better watch, it just is different looking. I love the Nomos Club Campus range. With that, the lugs are even more prominent, even more elongated, and you will get a strap gap. So those are all things you're gonna have to take into account. But if you want to kind of almost step up to an in-house movement, to a kind of more fun, youthful brand that maybe has some more fun with colors, then a Nomos is definitely an option you should be considering at this price point. And that's why if you're going for this watch, I'd recommend trying to find one used. So final thoughts on the Stowa. It is a watch I've been wanting to experience for about maybe 2 years now. It is not a watch you see very often. You don't see it very often on Instagram. You don't see it very often on YouTube. And when people talk about Stowa, they talk about their pilot's watches. They don't really talk about their dressier offerings. I think Stowa make a beautiful, beautiful chronograph that people really don't talk about that often. So it's things like these. And I was happy to get my hands on with this model to kind of show you guys, to experience it for myself. And at the end of the day, it is a really, really good watch. Would I pay retail for it? Honestly, I wouldn't. I would probably go for a Nomos. I'd go for maybe a micro brand like Fairer, even though it's a little bit of a different aesthetic. But there's a lot of other things you can get in that price point. I think this is definitely in that sweet spot of being in the used market at around 600, maybe 700 for a really good example. It's a good watch. It fits well, it's a nice size, it has a vintage styling, it is just, for all intents and purposes, a great black dial to add to your collection. Do I think it is a perfect watch? No, but really no watch is perfect. But if you are interested in this watch and after watching this video you are still interested in getting one, I would say go for it. Again, look used, but go for it. And if you get one, let me know how it went. I hope you got something from this video. Hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you in another one.